Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Youngerman, and I'm a healthcare attorney at Kirschenbaum and Kirschenbaum, and I'll be leading the presentation today. Today we'll be discussing employee stuff. So some of you may be asking, why employee stuff? Aren't you a healthcare attorney, and why are you talking about employment? So the answer is yes, I am a healthcare attorney, but in working with our clients, we do spend a lot of our time working with practice issues and daily operations, and a lot of that does revolve around employment matters. So for example, I regularly work with our clients on varied labor matters such as day-to-day issues that arise in the practice or in the business, general operations, including but not limited to the topics we'll be talking about today, policies and procedures, including employee handbooks for your staff, severance agreements upon termination or upon a mutual agreement to terminate. So today's topics, we'll be briefly discussing classification, better known as misclassification, overtime, breaks, vacation, sick leave, and holidays, time clocks, and company policies. Let's get started with our first topic, which is misclassification. One of the major issues that arises in labor law today is misclassification, how we classify our employees or independent contractors. So, what are the two main issues we're going to talk about with this category? The first is what I just mentioned, employee versus independent contractor. The second, once that's defined and we've determined that someone is an employee, are they exempt or non-exempt from certain worker protections, such as overtime and minimum wage. So we'll get to each of those in turn. So I'm going to start right now with a quote from the Department of Labor, which kind of summarizes why this is such an issue of importance to them. So when an employer is improperly classify an employee as an independent contractor, the employees may not receive important workplace protections, such as the minimum wage, overtime compensation, unemployment insurance, and workers' compensation. Misclassification also results in lower tax revenues for government and an uneven playing field for employers who properly classify their workers. Although independent contracting relationships can be advantageous for workers and businesses, some employees may be intentionally misclassified as a means to cut costs and avoid compliance with labor laws. So this is very important for everyone to realize that this is definitely a hot topic, a major issue for the Department of Labor, and something they're really focusing on these days. So along those lines, let's start with employee versus independent contractor. So on July 15, 2015, the Department of Labor issued an administrator's interpretation outlining the economic realities test. Very important to note, this is not a new test. It is simply new guidance from the Department of Labor where they have reaffirmed their classifications under the Fair Labor Standards Act, which is the act that offers a lot of workers' protections such as overtime and minimum wage. What is most important about this interpretation? It is showing you a clear signal that the Department of Labor is taking this seriously and is very concerned about misclassification and is really looking to enforce. We will review this test together briefly in a moment, but an additional issue I would like to address with you is how this interpretation will impact on other agencies and their tests. For example, the IRS uses a common law control test to determine if someone is an employee or an independent contractor for tax classification purposes. Many are now wondering if the IRS will sign on to this test. Currently, they still use the common law control test, but any test that gives a more favorable view towards classifying someone as an employee and therefore giving better tax revenue to the government may be in their favor to use in the future. So it's definitely something to keep in mind, especially because the Department of Labor and the IRS have recently entered into a memorandum of understanding where they've agreed to cooperate and work more closely on classification issues. What that means, you have an issue with classification with the IRS, you will likely have one with the Department of Labor as well, and vice versa. So it is very important that we're in compliance with all requirements, and since this standard is more stringent, we do recommend making sure that you're in compliance with it as a going concern. The economic realities test. So this test focuses on whether the worker is economically dependent on the employer or in business for him or herself. A worker who is economically dependent on the employer is suffered or permitted to work by the employer. So the Department of Labor interpretation has now made it very clear that when applying this test, most workers will in fact be classified as employees under the Fair Labor Standards Act. And again, remember, that means they're entitled to the workers' protections discussed, such as overtime and minimum wage. So it's very important. So how do we apply the test? There are several factors that are offered for consideration. We'll go through those briefly in a moment, but I want to stress to you that all of the factors must be considered. This is not a test where if one factor is met, the decision is made. It's a totality of the circumstances type approach. You also need to keep in mind that this is not a mechanical fashion. Again, we're looking at a broader concept of economic dependence. So we're looking at all of the factors together, not simply in a tally mentality, but instead really seeing if they're in business for themselves and truly an independent contractor, or really truly economically dependent and thus an employee. So let's take a look at some of these factors. The first is the extent to which the work performed is an integral part of the employer's business. So what does that mean? Let's give an example that the Department of Labor has utilized. If someone is working with a construction company that frames homes, the carpenter's work is clearly integral to the work being done. In comparison, a software developer who may be assisting the company by tracking bids is not considered integral to the work in the home, of framing the home. Second, the worker's opportunity for profit or loss depending on his or her managerial skill. So here we have an example of a cleaning company. A worker provides cleaning services for the company as assigned by the company. He does not independently schedule his own work. He does not solicit additional work, advertise services, or endeavor to reduce costs in any way. That person is classified as an employee. In contrast, the example given for an independent contractor classification was a worker who produces their own advertising, negotiates their own contracts, decides which jobs to perform and when, decides to hire helpers if needed, and recruits new clients. This worker is clearly exercising managerial skills that affect his opportunity for profit and loss, therefore indicative of an independent contractor. The third, the extent of the relative investments of the employer and the worker. So here, if we go back to our cleaning company example, if the company provides insurance for the worker, a vehicle for them to use to get to the site, all equipment and supplies, and occasionally the worker purchases some cleaning supplies they prefer to use, this person is truly an employee, because if you look at the relative investments of the employer versus the worker, it's clear that the investments are all on the employer's part, and they are truly an employee. In contrast, we have a worker who invests in their own vehicle to travel to various work sites. They rent their own space to store their vehicle and supplies. They advertise their own services, and they almost always provide their own equipment and supplies, not just on a case-by-case basis. They are more likely to be classified as an independent contractor. The others, 4, whether the work performed requires special skills and initiative. 5, the permanency of the relationship. And 6, the degree of control exercised or retained by the employer. So these are the general factors to be considered. So now that we have determined or made some inways into determining whether or not the person is an employee or independent contractor, we now have to look to what are their rights as an employee. So we have an employee. They are now entitled to overtime if they are not exempt. So what is the general rule? All employees are required to be paid overtime for hours worked more than 40 hours in a work week unless they are exempt. All right, so again, this is very important. This is the kind of thrust of the rule here. Employees are required to be paid overtime for hours worked more than 40 hours in a work week unless exempt. So we will briefly go through some common overtime questions that arise and kind of get to the meat of what this really means. The first question, how much do I have to pay for overtime? So this is going to be very state specific. In New York, overtime is time and a half as a minimum. What does that mean? Other states may be higher. So it's very important that if you're not New York based, you look into and confirm what that number is going to mean for you. Overtime question number 2. What is a work week? So remember, if we're going back to the relevance of the work week, it is more than 40 hours in a work week entitles someone to overtime. So it's very important that we have a true understanding of what that means. Employees' work week is a fixed and regularly recurring period of 168 hours, or 7 consecutive 24-hour periods. It does not need to coincide with the calendar week, and it may begin on any day and any hour of the day. So that is a choice for the employer, but it must be a consistent work week. So what does that mean? Can I average it out over the course of the month? No, it's based on the work week. So, for example, if an employee works 50 hours this week and 30 next, they are still entitled to overtime for the week where they worked over 40 hours. We cannot average the 2 weeks together to come to that 40-hour or below standard. Now, another important point to note, overtime pay is normally earned in a work week, must be paid on the regular pay day that you would be paying for the wages earned for that same work week. So it should be consistent with that time. So we should not be calculating overtime the month after it's occurred unless that is the regular payroll period. Now, kind of in line with this question of averaging and what entitlement based on 40 hours, what about special days, as we like to call them? A lot of employees are under the impression that if they work special hours, maybe it's a Saturday, maybe it's a night, maybe it's a holiday, they feel that they're entitled to overtime because it's not the standard hours of the practice. That is irrelevant. It is, again, based on the 40-hour work week. So if working on a Saturday takes them over 40 hours, then sure, they're entitled to overtime. But if 40 hours or less is including that Saturday, they're not entitled to overtime. Now, that being said, what I have seen with a number of employers is the choice to make it a policy to pay like overtime for special hours, but that is an employee benefit offered by an employer. That is not the law. So that is very important to note. Make sure you have a true understanding of the work week and make sure you have a good system in place to calculate the numbers. Third, this is one of the most important questions when it comes to overtime. Who's exempt? What does exempt mean? So some of our commonly used exemptions, especially in the health fields, executive, administrative, and professional. So please bear with me. This is the one and only time, I promise, we're going to be a little statutory heavy. I just want to make sure that you have a clear understanding of what each of these means. And as mentioned later in the slides as well, if anyone has questions or would like to see copies of these afterwards, we're happy to send that as well. To qualify for the executive employee exemption, all, not one of, all of the following tests must be met. First, the employee must be compensated on a salary basis at a rate not less than $455 per week. Second, the employee's primary duty must be managing the enterprise or managing a customarily recognized department or subdivision of the enterprise. Third, the employee must customarily and regularly direct the work of at least 2 or more other full-time employees or their equivalent. And fourth and final, the employee must have the authority to hire or fire other employees, or the employee's suggestions and recommendations as to the hiring, firing, advancement, promotion, or any other change of status of other employees must be given particular weight. So again, those were the requirements for the executive exemption, and all 4 must be met for an employee to be considered exempt under that category and not entitled to overtime. Second, the administrative exemption. This one has 3 factors that all must be met. The first is the employee must be compensated on a salary or fee basis at a rate not less than $455 per week. The employee's primary duty must be the performance of office or non-manual work directly related to the management or general business operations of the employer or the employer's customers. And the employee's primary duty includes the exercise of discretion and independent judgment with respect to matters of significance. Again, those are the 3 factors for administrative exemption. Third, the professional exemption. To qualify for this learned professional employee exemption, the following 4 factors must be met. First, the employee must be compensated on a salary or fee basis at a rate not less than $455 per week. Second, the employee's primary duty must be the performance of work requiring advanced knowledge, defined as work which is predominantly intellectual in character, and which includes work requiring the consistent exercise of discretion and judgment. Third, the advanced knowledge must be in a field of science or learning. And fourth, the advanced knowledge must be customarily acquired by a prolonged course of specialized intellectual instruction. Okay, so those are the 4 factors for the professional exemption. Now, 2 big things to note. The definition of salary and fee, as I mentioned, is by regulation. And so if you have questions about how that is actually defined, please feel free to follow up. The states may also vary their requirements. For example, in New York, the exemptions follow the federal requirements generally, but the minimum weekly salary amount is higher than the $455 outlined in the federal rules. So in New York, the rule right now is currently $656.25 per week, which is increasing to $657 on December 31st of this year. Okay, so those are the exemptions that are most commonly used in these type of professions. Otherwise, employees would be entitled to overtime. Number 4, so if I have a truly exempt person, do I have to pay overtime? The answer, of course, is no. But, and this is a huge but, you better be sure they're actually exempt, right? So if you're not positive, you want to make sure you're following up with your accountants and your lawyers and ensuring that you have a full understanding and that they're properly classified. We always recommend getting a written opinion from an accountant who specializes in this area on this topic. Okay, our 5th and final overtime question, and then we'll switch gears a little bit here, is I've classified all my employees as exempt. I pay them all a salary. I don't pay overtime, but the salary is really high and they're really happy, so I'm fine, right? We hear this all the time, okay? Having a high salary and happy employees does not excuse you from the requirements of overtime. Why is this so important? Okay, so if they're entitled to overtime, the fact that they have a high salary will just hurt you more because remember, it's time and a half their regular rate of pay. So it's based on how much they're getting paid. So the fact that they get paid more, if you're found responsible for overtime benefits, you may actually wind up owing them more money. So that's not helping you, it's hurting you. And remember, just because they're happy now doesn't mean they will always remain happy, and something might change and that may lead them to reporting you. In addition, they're not the only ones that could report you, right? Other employees, competitors, or an audit could result in an investigation by the Department of Labor. And as mentioned before, that could lead to investigation by the IRS and other parties who are concerned with your proper classification. Also, there are other benefits beyond just pay and overtime that result from your classification, and so this is also important. So for example, we have our minimum wage. So if you're not tracking their hours because they're salaried and you're not paying attention to the hours worked and the hourly rate that they'd be entitled to, you may wind up in trouble as well with the minimum wage. And so we'll talk about that briefly now. So the federal minimum wage for covered non-exempt workers is not less than $7.25 per hour, effective as of July 24, 2009. Now, here's kind of our caveat to that. The states may and are likely higher. So for example, in New York, it is currently $8.75, increasing to $9 on December 31st, 2015. And then even further to note, cities and towns could be higher than the state. So it is very important that you know the rules for where you are practicing or working. For example here, there's been movements in New York City to increase the minimum wage because of the cost of living. So again, it's very important that you know the federal requirements, your state requirements, and your city requirements, and of course comply with the highest standard. Here are just some examples of the minimum wage requirements by state as of January 1st, 2015. Again, note some of those have increased or may increase as of the end of this year, and also note again that these are the state requirements. Again, check your city, towns, villages, and all of these specific requirements. Okay, so changing gears a little bit from our classification conversation, we'll talk briefly here about lunch and breaks. So the federal law does not require breaks or meal periods with very limited exceptions. For example, there's an exemption for nursing mothers. There's certain breaks that must be provided to them. But generally speaking, we're not required to provide breaks. However, here we go again with our state requirements. There are plenty of states that do require meal periods or breaks. Then, one step further, we have our cities, towns, and villages. So for example, New York State does not require lunch or, New York State does require state requirement for lunch based on the hours the employee is working. In addition to that, they have requirements if you're working certain hours. So for example, employees who are working late or starting early, there's additional break and meal requirements to keep in mind. And as I was saying before, there may also be further city-village requirements as well. Now here's our example of where there are no federal requirements or state requirements, but we do have a city and town requirement in New York. So vacation, sick days, and holidays. Federally, there is no requirement for pay for time not worked. Some states may have requirements. New York does not, as far as general vacation, sick days, and holidays. City-town requirements. Those of you with employees in New York City may unfortunately be very familiar with the New York City sick leave law. Under this requirement, employers with 5 or more employees who are hired to work more than 80 hours a calendar year in New York City must provide paid sick leave. Employers with less than 5 employees must provide unpaid sick leave. Okay, so there's stringent requirements for New York City for sick leave. So even though, again, there may be no federal requirement or even a state requirement in your area, there might be a city, a town, or village requirement. In addition, we have our company policies, of course. If you've promised certain benefits to your employees, you must abide by them. In addition, I want to stress and point out, when we talk about sick days, we're talking about general sick days. There are, of course, additional requirements for Family Medical Leave Act, maternity, and other special circumstances. Time clocks. Time clocks can be one of your biggest allies. So some people are very hesitant to use them, but let me give you a reason why I say it's such a great resource for you when it comes to wage and hour issues. If an employee says to an investigator, I worked 50 hours a week every week this year, you say, no way, that's crazy. They worked 35 hours every week. How are you proving it? What records do you have on file to say that that employee is not telling the truth, right? If you had time clocks showing what time they arrived and what time they left work, and every time they clocked out for an unpaid break for lunch, you would have a much better stance to defend yourself. Without records, you have no proof, and it's going to be a much more uphill climb for you. Now, important with time clocks, and here's the caveat to that advice, you should have policies in place regarding when you may and may not clock in and what disciplinary measures are available should you abuse the time clock policies. For example, what is the most common way someone would abuse a time clock policy? Signing in and out for somebody else. Okay, that should be a serious offense that an employee is aware of the consequences, which could include something as serious as termination of employment. What other things? Arriving early and signing in early when they're not scheduled to be there. Things of that nature, we need to have policies in advance on how we're going to handle an employee who violates our policy. But again, strongly recommending having a time clock or some other type of mechanism in place to carefully and accurately track our employees' time. Company policies. This is another defensive protective measure you can have in place. Having defined policies will enable you to enforce discipline and take action against your employees when they actually break the rules. And without policies, who's to say that they were ever advised that they weren't permitted to do something? Also, along the lines of this, document, document, document. As lawyers, we can never tell you enough how important it is to have records, and you want to make sure that you're tracking everything. On December 2nd, we'll be offering a brief webinar to discuss some of the recommended policies and procedures for your practice and staff. And for those of us who are familiar with firing, unemployment, policing, etc. in our offices, we know we need to have paper. So definitely please feel free to sign up after the webinar for that one as well. It'll be advertised as well in the newsletter. Some brief frequently asked questions regarding these topics. First, my employee worked 12 hours on Monday when she was scheduled for 8. Does she get overtime? So this is another question that goes back to our work week comment. So the answer is, hopefully obvious to everyone now, overtime pay is not required just because the employee went over her daily hours or hours worked on a special day, such as a Saturday. So if she's working 12 hours instead of 8, nobody cares unless that takes her over 40 for the work week. Second, my employee worked 12 hours on Monday when she was scheduled for 8. Can I end her hours early on Wednesday to make up the time? The answer, in accordance with the State Department of Labor, is yes, as long as you provide them advance notice. How much notice? There's no specification, but very important to note, it should be before the employee arrives at the office. Otherwise, if they arrive and you tell them that you're going to have a delay in their start time, you may be responsible for paying them some portion of their pay since they showed up on time for their shift. Now, are there maximum hours an employee can be asked to work? The answer, generally speaking, is no. What are the exceptions to that, of course? There's rules regarding minors working. Okay? The other thing to keep in mind, and this is more of a practical standpoint, is safety and productivity. From a safety standpoint, for those healthcare providers on the phone, of course, we want to be very careful about how many hours our employees are working and making sure that it's in our best interest of our patients and staff that they're keeping safe practices. For our productivity point of view, we want to make sure that our employees are not burning out, are not overworked and exhausted and making mistakes because they are not fully rested. Final question and answer that we get all the time, can I fire an employee for no reason? So this is going to, again, be very state specific. In New York, we are an at-will state, which means absent any contract agreeing otherwise and absent any prohibited discrimination, you may fire any person at any time for no reason or any reason at all. Right? So that is the answer in New York. Other states, there will be more specific requirements. But again, remember those exceptions. We cannot be firing someone for discriminatory reasons, and we cannot be firing someone if we have a contract that states otherwise. So how can we help you with these issues? So first off, as mentioned before, we can assist you with drafting policies and procedures. We can assist you with employment agreements if you'd like to have those in place, daily operations and employment issues that may arise in your practice or business, advice on termination procedures and severance agreements if you wish to enter into those with your employees, where you may agree on confidentiality. You can also agree on certain releases from liability. And then again, hopefully, knocking on wood never happens, but assistance with interactions with an investigator if an investigator does contact your practice. And of course, the best advice I can give you for that is if an investigator comes knocking, is to immediately call an attorney who specializes in this area to be of assistance to you and available to speak with the investigator and not to speak to them directly without counsel. In addition to employment matters, of course, our firm does general healthcare work as well, so we can assist you with a variety of transactions, including drafting, reviewing, and negotiating any deals with full range of services from licensing of space, supplies, and personnel to buy, sales, and partnership agreements. We also, of course, focus on practice and billing company compliance and general business matters. So what are some resources we can offer for you? Of course, our attorneys, right? So you can reach out to our team here at Kirschenbaum. In addition, we have a newsletter. I'm sure many of you are familiar with it, and that's how you signed up for our webinar today. But I do recommend, if you're not already on it, to join our healthcare newsletter. It does go out about twice a week, and it is a free Q&A, biggest term, free Q&A, which means if you have questions that will be applicable to lots of people listening today, we'd be happy to answer those for you for free. So specifically, if there's things I mentioned today that were unclear, or you had follow-up questions on, we will be happy to publish answers to those through the newsletter or through any other topics that you have in mind. Also, check out prior articles and topics that we've written on a variety of healthcare topics available on our website, and all of our prior webinars will be available, as will the one from today. Finally, if you have any questions, you can feel free to give a call to myself or Jennifer. Our contact information is listed below. Those are our email addresses and our extensions here. Always feel free to give us a call or shoot us an email if you have a question about today's webinar or otherwise. And otherwise, I'd like to thank you for taking the time to join us today. We look forward to having you on future webinars. And if you have any suggestions about other topics or follow-up things from today that you'd like to hear more about, please feel free to let us know. And we wish you a wonderful day. Thank you for joining us. Take care.